Hi everybody, Dr. Ahles here. In this short video, we're going to talk about the smallest formed element that we see in blood. That's those platelets. And we're also going to talk about all the steps that your body goes through when you have a bleeding blood vessel. When we talk about platelets, like I mentioned, these are the very smallest of the formed elements. Remember that formed elements means the cells or the solid structures in your blood. If you want to see how small platelets are, we've got a blood smear over here. All of these red circles that we see are our erythrocytes, our red blood cells, but wedged in between with them are these small little cell fragments. These cell fragments are the platelets. Platelets are considered cell fragments because their origin story, where they come from, is we see these big cells in the body called megakaryocytes. Megakaryocytes are very, very large. And when they get to a certain size, this enormous size, they'll actually split apart, forming about 2,000 to 3,000 different platelets. So platelets all come from these huge cells, megakaryocytes, that divide up into smaller pieces. We create platelets through a process called thrombopoiesis, just like we talked about making white blood cells through leukopoiesis, or red blood cells through erythropoiesis. The process of thrombopoiesis is constantly occurring because platelets only live about 10 days. Remember we said that red blood cells lived about 120 days, while platelets hardly live any time at all. To keep the process of thrombopoiesis going, we use a hormone called thrombopoietin. So here's a wink wink, nudge nudge. Anytime you see this beginning part thrombo always means platelets. Thrombopoiesis, thrombopoietin, we're talking about those platelets or we're talking about blood clotting. So platelets are critical to a process called coagulation, making that blood clot. But we're going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about all of the different ways that your body responds when we have bleeding. Coagulation is one of them, but there are a couple of things it does before that. So the process of stopping bleeding as a group is called hemostasis. So hemostasis begins when a blood vessel's wall has been damaged. This is what happens when you get a paper cut. This is what happens when you get a bruise. The wall of a blood vessel tears, and the body realizes it's not good for us to be losing our blood to the environment. So it goes through this process, hemostasis. By the way, stasis is what we saw at the end of homeostasis. Stasis means our steady state. So hemostasis, keeping our blood at a normal level, doing its normal thing. So the first thing the body's going to do when a blood vessel wall gets torn is do these things called vascular spasms. Now it sounds really scary, but all a vascular spasm is the smooth muscle tissue in the middle of the blood vessel contracting. When it contracts, this is going to make the size of the blood vessel smaller, so we decrease the amount of blood that goes to the area where there's a tear. So step one, my blood vessel is damaged. I'm going to decrease the amount of blood that I send to that area. I'm going to do these things called vascular spasms. Thing number two that I'm going to do is I'm going to try to plug up the hole in my blood vessel wall. So to fill up that hole in the blood vessel wall, I use platelets, those tiny things we talked about. So platelets are going to go to the site of the blood vessel injury, and they'll be attracted to the collagen fibers that are suddenly being exposed because the blood vessel wall has been torn. So as platelets see those collagen fibers, they attach to them and then spit out some chemicals to recruit other platelets to that area. So number one, we decrease the blood flow going to the site of injury. Number two, we plugged the hole using platelets. Then we get to step three, which is what platelets' specialty is, and that's coagulation. So coagulation is where we finally literally form a blood clot. So a blood clot is a group of protein fibers, specifically called fibrin. These fibrin proteins form a space inside the blood vessel where no blood tissue, no blood extracellular fluid is getting to that site of the injury. So before we can form a clot, we first make those blood vessels smaller, then we plug the hole, then we finally form this clot in the process of coagulation. So let's talk about the specific molecules that are involved in each of these parts of hemostasis. The first molecules that we're going to talk about are involved in forming that platelet plug, or in stopping the bleeding initially. So the first factor for us to be familiar with is called von Willebrand factor, VWF. Von Willebrand factor is the molecule that's attached to the collagen fibers that are inside your blood vessel walls. When the blood vessel wall is damaged because of a cut or because of a bruise, these collagen fibers are exposed with von Willebrand factor. That factor is attractive to your circulating platelets. They're going to go grab it and attach to the collagen. Once the platelets are attached, they're going to spit out several different chemicals to increase the strength of this platelet plug. So the first thing they're going to spit out is ADP. When a platelet spits out ADP, that's going to cause other platelets to come to the site of this platelet plug. It also, when other platelets get this message, they become activated, which is going to allow them to spit out more ADP to bring over more platelets. So we're building this strong plug by all of these platelets coming. Another chemical that the platelets split out is called thromboxane. Thromboxane is another activator for platelets, but primarily what I want you to think of with thromboxane is it causes vasoconstriction. Vaso, blood vessel, constriction, smaller. When a platelet spits out thromboxane, it's continuing to tell the blood vessel, keep those vascular spasms going. Keep this blood vessel smaller so that we lose less blood. That's the same as what we do with the chemical serotonin. Platelets spit this out as well to encourage those blood vessels to stay constricted. So, platelet plug. This is what I do to literally plug the hole in the blood vessel wall. What makes my platelets first start coming over? Von Willebrand factor. Once those platelets are there, they're going to spit out ADP to get other platelets to come, and they'll use that same chemical as well as thromboxane to activate those platelets. Thromboxane and serotonin will also work together to tell our blood vessels, limit the amount of blood that's coming to this area. Remember, step 1 of hemostasis, stopping a bleed, making the blood vessel smaller. Step 2, making a platelet plug. Once I've plugged the hole, the final thing I need to do is coagulation. So coagulation is literally forming a blood clot. We do those other things first. Now we're going to make a blood clot. There are 2 different pathways that your body will use to build blood clots. We call them either the intrinsic pathway or the extrinsic pathway. The names sound really scary. I promise it's not as scary as it sounds. When we talk about the intrinsic pathway of coagulation, the intrinsic way of clotting your blood, this is all things that are inside the bloodstream. So intrinsic means inside the bloodstream. These are things that come from platelets that are going to cause us to do the process of blood clotting. Now I know that my screen doesn't specifically say this. Here's what I want you to add. Get my little pen here. I want you to add the words platelet factor. Apologize for my writing here. Platelet factor. Platelet factor, or PF, this is a chemical that your platelets spit out That chemical tells the body we're supposed to do blood clotting. So when I have the intrinsic pathway leading me to coagulate my blood, I'm using platelet factor. I'm using a message from the platelets to tell the bloodstream, hey, we need to create a blood clot. Interestingly though, I can also use the extrinsic pathway to lead to blood clotting. When I talk about the extrinsic pathway for blood clotting, I'm using things that are outside of the bloodstream. So what I mean by that, let's underline, highlight, star tissue factor. Tissue factor is a chemical that's secreted by the tissues that live next to the blood vessel. When we start to see platelets, when we have messages from the platelets that there's been tissue damage, the tissues will spit out this tissue factor. This tissue factor can also start the process of coagulation. So, we need to make a blood clot. My platelets that are part of the intrinsic pathway help us to do that, or my cells that are outside of the blood vessel are going to spit out their own message, tissue factor, to trigger the extrinsic pathway to clotting. Pretty much all the time, we're actually going to see both of these pathways involved in the process of forming a clot because both of them converge on the same pathways. Notice right here, we end up in this common pathway because of the chemicals, the way that these processes work. So how does coagulation occur? Step one, either through the intrinsic or the extrinsic pathways, we're going to make this hormone called prothrombinase. Prothrombinase, see this ACE at the end, is an enzyme. Its job is to chop up the protein called prothrombin. When we see this thing pro at the beginning of thrombin, pro in this case means a precursor. So prothrombin, not active, can't do anything, but when the extrinsic or intrinsic pathway makes this enzyme, prothrombinase, it's going to chop up prothrombin and turn it into thrombin. Once I have active thrombin in the bloodstream, thrombin is going to go and chop up fibrinogen. Fibrinogen, this end part here, this is an inactive precursor as well. But when I chop off parts of it and turn it into fibrin, now I've created a protein that in the bloodstream will loosely start to grab things. But over time, the more red blood cells getting caught in this fibrin protein, the more that I start to form this clot inside the blood vessels. So, coagulation, forming a blood clot. We can do that with things from platelets, the intrinsic pathway, or we can do that with things from the tissues, the extrinsic pathway. Regardless of which of these pathways I use, I'm always going to start with an enzyme that activates prothrombin into thrombin. Thrombin going to go chop up fibrinogen to make fibrin. Fibrin, what's able to capture those red blood cells and make that ugly scab that you see. So let's take a step back and look at the process of coagulation overall. What do I need to do to form a clot? And adding to our discussion, what do I need to do to get rid of it? So, blood clots help us to prevent blood loss. We've made the platelet plug and then we want to make sure no liquid gets out. We build a clot. We make these platelet plugs and this blood clot from those fibrin proteins. And over time, we're going to modify that clot. So what I make at the beginning gets transformed into something more stable. So let's say that my blood vessel is starting to heal itself. As my parts of the blood vessels start to heal themselves, we do what's called clot retraction. Clot retraction means that I'm pulling away that blood clot to bring back together the two sides of the blood vessel wall. So clot retraction is when my blood clot that I've made here slowly gets squeezed apart for the sake of getting this blood vessel wall back to normal. But the second step, very important when we're thinking about blood clots, is what we call fibrinolysis. Fibrinolysis. Anytime we see lysis, we're thinking breaking. When we finish a reaction to stop blood clotting, when my blood vessel has healed itself, we have to break down fibrin so that we don't go make a blood clot somewhere else. So when it's time for us to break down fibrin, we chop up a protein called plasminogen. When I chop that up, I turn it into plasmin. The plasmin protein is really good at going through and chopping up fibrins that were there next to the clot. Now, let me pause for a moment. I've told you the names and functions of like 20 different proteins, right? Or it feels that way. What I want you to do is make yourself a list on a piece of paper. I want you to write the name on one side of that paper, plasminogen, for example. And on the other side of that paper, so left side, plasminogen, right side, we're going to write down that it's activated or turned into plasmin. Then below plasminogen, we're going to write plasmin on the left side. And on the right side, we're going to write degrades fibrin. So go through and do these things with all the stuff we had before. Prothrombinase, prothrombin, thrombin. Make yourself a list where we see the name of a protein and what it does. One other quick note that I want to give you about blood clotting, and this is something that you don't have in your notes, so I need you to write it down. Over here, underneath my picture, I've given you 2 vocabulary terms that I want to make sure we know. The first term is thrombus. When we talk about a thrombus, we're talking about this clot that I formed inside the wall of a blood vessel. So through the process of coagulation, through the process of forming a platelet plug, we make something called a thrombus. Thrombus, totally good and fine for us. What's not good and fine for us is what we call an embolus. An embolus is when I make a blood clot that's not lodged in a blood vessel wall. That blood clot is floating around in the bloodstream. If I have an embolus floating around in the bloodstream, this clot floating around, it can actually block blood vessels that are taking oxygen-rich blood to other parts of the body. This is why I have to do fibrinolysis, why I have to chop up those fibrin proteins, because if I don't, I might form an embolus that floats around the bloodstream and ends up blocking my blood supply to other critical organs, like, for example, the lungs, a pulmonary embolism, or like the brain, and an embolism that leads to a stroke. So at the very end of blood clotting, the last thing I have to do, get rid of that clot so it doesn't travel throughout my bloodstream and cause me problems elsewhere.